Welcome to the first of our International Day series, where we're here to celebrate World Water Day. St. Petersburg is an appropriate place to celebrate. While other cities are increasing water per capita use in the last 20 years, St. Petersburg has actually reduced it 30%. Through the Green Lodging program led by hotels such as the Trade Winds, they've achieved even further reductions of 36% in their water use in the last couple of years. And so we're continuing to improve in that regard. We're also pleased to welcome some 1,376 people who've registered to watch this program online from 48 states and 70 different countries in the world. So hopefully we'll be seeing some of those via our internet broadcast later this evening. We're going to begin with our featured speaker, Dr. Sandra Postel. Sandra is the director of the Global Water Policy Institute, author of The Last Oasis and Rivers of Life, and considered by many to be the top expert in the world on global water policy. And so without wanting to take any more of her time, let me welcome Sandra Postel.
Well, good evening, and thank you all so much for coming out to celebrate World Water Day. This is a great event, and I'm just incredibly honored to be part of it, and I very much want to thank Dave Randle and the Global Healing Initiative for inviting me to be here with you tonight. As I say, we're here to celebrate water, which I think we'd all agree is hands down the most amazing substance in the universe. 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, and as the writer D.H. Lawrence said, there's this third thing that makes it water, and nobody really knows what that is. What we do know, though, is that water is the basis of life. And I have very little doubt now. I've been working on water issues for the better part of 25 years, and I have very little doubt that one of the biggest challenges we're going to be facing is figuring out how to meet the water demands of 8 billion people. We're about 6.5 billion now, heading up toward 8 billion. While at the same time we protect the aquatic ecosystems that support our economies and support so much other life on this planet with us. It's a big challenge. It's not just an environmental challenge. It's certainly not just a water challenge. It's a very broad societal challenge that, as we'll see, is going to affect a lot of facets of our society and of our lives. As we think about water tonight, keep in mind 2 very important things. One, there's no substitute for water. We're going to be in the midst for a while now of a transition away from oil and coal toward solar, toward wind, toward other renewable sources of energy. And hopefully we'll do that transition fairly rapidly. But there's no transitioning away from water. So we can't think about water as a replaceable commodity. No substitutes for most of its uses. And secondly, thanks to the hydrologic cycle, which we've all learned about from grammar school, I suppose, water is a renewable resource. Water is renewable thanks to the cycle between the air, sea, and land, but it's finite. There's only so much water made available here in Florida, in the southeastern United States, in the whole country, and in all the 70 countries in which people are listening to us tonight. There's only so much made available, renewable but finite. And so one of the most inconvenient truths, to steal a phrase from Al Gore, about water is this, that its finiteness means that the increasing demand, the ever-increasing demand for water is incompatible with sustaining freshwater life and the health of freshwater ecosystems. So this pattern that we've had throughout history and up to recent times, continuing today, of increasing our demand for water every time we have a need for more, is incompatible, fundamentally, with sustaining the rest of life on the planet. And this is really the crux of the challenge that we're talking about. So let's look for a minute at how we got here, where we are, and how we got to this place. First, some facts on the ground. You've probably heard some of the statistics about global water. If you look, globally, we've got 5 to 10 times more water than you would need to support the human population. But a lot of that water isn't available to us. A lot of it isn't where people and farmers are. And so much of it is not really accessible for the things we need it for. And if we look around the world at what's happening physically to the resource, we can see that very, very clearly. We've got major rivers now that are no longer reaching the sea. The Colorado, the Rio Grande in this country, the Nile. We have numerous aquatic ecosystems around the globe that are in serious states of decline. We look in our backyard here in Florida, we can point to the Everglades, right? The river of grass that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote so eloquently about shrunk by half now over the last 70 years and affected very much by water diversions, by pollution. We can point to Lake Chad in Africa, which has shrunk dramatically from not only drought, but also diversions for irrigation. And probably the most dramatic example, and one that deeply affected me when I went to see it about, 12 years ago, the Aral Sea in Central Asia, which is probably the most extreme example of what can go wrong when you fail to take into account the health of an ecosystem. This used to be the 4th largest lake, and the diversions of the 2 rivers going into it to grow cotton in the deserts of Central Asia set the lake on a long trajectory of shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. 60,000 fishing jobs are lost. Most of the fish species are gone. And the health of the people in this area, not only the economy, but the health of the people, very dramatically affected by the damage to the surrounding lands and villages and towns in what's called the disaster zone. There's no place on earth, I think, that better shows us the connections between the health of an ecosystem and the health of the economy and the people that depend on that ecosystem than the Aral Sea. And while it's an extreme example, and one that I would commend to you to read about if you're interested in this, it's not a parable, it's not something that's just out there standing on its own. It's the trajectory that we're on in other places too. And if we're not careful, we'll end up in that same place. We're building up a very large water deficit in the form of groundwater overpumping. And this is literally sort of an out-of-sight, out-of-mind kind of problem. Large portions of China, of India, Iran, Mexico, North Africa, much of the western United States, are extracting groundwater faster than it's being replenished. And how does this manifest? It manifests in water tables falling steadily, in the depletion of underground aquifers that farmers and cities depend upon. It's hard to get good data on groundwater, but if my estimates are roughly right and those of others, it looks like we're overpumping groundwater in key parts of the world, if you add it all up, overpumping groundwater in an amount equal to roughly 2 Nile rivers worth of water. And most of that's in agriculture. So if you translate that into how much food depends on this unsustainable practice, it comes out to about 10%. And researchers think it's more like 25% in India. So that's a worrisome thing. It's sort of a bubble in the food economy that we're going to have to grapple with as time goes on. A fundamentally unsustainable practice. In effect, we're using some of today's water to meet tomorrow's water to meet today's demands, which raises questions about how we're going to meet the needs of tomorrow. We have a very large backlog of unmet needs in water and sanitation. I'm sure many of you have read about this in the news. It's been in the media a lot, that we have more than 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to a safe supply of drinking water, something you and I take very much for granted when we turn the tap on every day. Over 1 billion people don't have access to a safe supply of drinking water, and even more, about 2.4 billion don't have adequate sanitation. And this is a major, major cause of disease and death in poor countries. If today's an average day, something like 3,500 people will die from waterborne disease, most of them children under the age of 5. And we have increasing competition for water. As water is growing increasingly scarce, we're seeing increased competition between countries, between states and provinces, within countries, between farmers and cities within the same region, and increasingly between people and the natural environment. Competition in all these different ways. And this competition is deepening, it's getting more intense in a lot of places, and it's spreading. as population grows and as water demands grow. So this is a major, major challenge. Really uncharted territory if you look historically. And how we as individuals, as communities, as countries, as a community of nations respond to this picture, respond to this water challenge, is going to have very important consequences. And I think the four major ones are consequences for food production and food security, for human health, the health of the aquatic environment that supports everything else, and for social and political stability as this competition for water heats up. So let's consider for a minute how we got to this place so we can think again about how we get out of this situation. If you look back over the last half century, what you see is, since 1950, a very dramatic rise in population and in economic growth. Significant population and economic growth taking off after 1950. And along with that surge in population and economic growth, we had a surge in demand for various kinds of water projects to supply irrigation water, hydropower development, flood control as we settled along rivers, and water supplies to provide drinking water. And much of that demand was met by building more and larger water projects. Groundwater wells, yes, and also very large dams on the world's rivers. If you look back to 1950, we had about 5,000 large dams in the world. The dam industry defines a large dam as one that's at least 15 meters high, about 45 feet high or higher. We had 5,000 in 1950. We have 45,000 today, which means we've been building about 2 large dams a day, every day, for the better part of half a century. And this is a very large change in the hydrologic environment in a very short period of time. I mean, 50 years, a half century is, a geologic twinkling of an eye, a very, very short period of time. Very little time for species within these river systems to adapt to the kinds of changes brought about. We know very clearly what dams do economically. They do important things. They generate hydropower. They provide flood control. They generate supplies of water for irrigation and for cities. But we came very late to understanding, really, what dams do ecologically in a river system. And if you think about what a dam is doing in a watershed, it's really severing a whole host of connections that tributaries and rivers have with each other, with the floodplain, with the channel, with the delta downstream, and with the sea into which rivers ultimately empty. And with those connections getting severed, what you find is a loss of what we call ecological service, the work that nature does in a healthy state. And this work includes really important things. It includes things like cueing fish to spawn. Many fish rely on, for example, a spring flood as their cue to start heading upstream in a river and to begin to find spawning grounds. Without that high flow, without the cue, they may not move up. The dam itself may block them from moving up. Other ecological services, the distribution of nutrients to floodplains, which keeps floodplains highly productive. Delivering sediments to deltas. We've seen this with the issue of wetlands along the Gulf Coast, particularly when Katrina struck. Maintaining salinity levels, that freshwater flow into the coastal zones, helps maintain the salinity balance that's so important for coastal fisheries. Generally, it's supporting a whole host of habitat conditions that provides conditions for life within those river systems. All that severing along the way creates conditions in which the species that have adapted to those conditions can no longer survive like they used to. And so as a result, we're in this position now of seeing a whole host of freshwater species at risk of extinction. And this is a very, we hear a lot about tropical forests, but actually the data seem to suggest that proportionately, freshwater species are more at risk of extinction even than terrestrial species. So happening in a very serious way. The World Conservation Union estimates that 20% of freshwater fish worldwide is at risk of extinction or already extinct. Just 2 months ago, the government of China announced publicly with a press release that one in three fish species within the Yellow River are extinct, not threatened with extinction, but have already gone extinct. This was an amazing admission for the Chinese government, that 1 in 3 fish species within the Yellow River are already extinct. It's sort of a mind-blowing announcement. Here in the United States, we have, many Americans don't know, we have an extraordinary diversity of freshwater life in our rivers, lakes, streams. And again, many of them are at risk of extinction. We have, according to Nature Conservancy data, 37% of our freshwater fish are at risk of extinction to some degree. Half of the crayfish, 2/3 of the mussels. Most of you, I'm sure, know that mussels do a phenomenal job of cleansing our water. We call them living filters because they do such a great job of removing pollutants from our waters, and 2/3 of them are at risk of extinction. Now, the fact that our economic balance sheets don't take the value of biodiversity and the value of these ecological services into account, that we don't make an accounting for them, means that the true cost of our water use and the true cost of our management of water is much higher than we realize, because we're not taking these important values into account. If you think about wetlands, for example, which do a remarkable job of purifying water, of helping to mitigate floods and droughts, providing habitat for fish and wildlife and birds. Globally, they're estimated to be worth somewhere between $200 and $940 billion per year in the form of these services that they provide. But how often do we actually attribute a value to wetlands when we're trying to decide whether to put in a shopping mall or put in a subdivision over here? Usually they're attributed this kind of a value, a 0, right? Which is precise, but precisely wrong. And because we don't know the exact value, it doesn't mean we should attribute it a 0 value. If we begin to establish some values for these systems, we'll find that our decision-making about them improves. On top of all this, before we leave sort of the gloomy part of this and get into what we do about it, we of course have this wild card of climate change. Global warming is going to fundamentally alter the hydrologic cycle. We know this in very important ways. We're already seeing the tip of the iceberg on this. And of course there are a lot of uncertainties, but there's some things we can now be fairly certain about in terms of how global warming is going to impact water. It's fairly certain we're going to see more intense floods and more intense droughts, and possibly a larger number of them as well. We're going to see cities and farming regions that rely on glacial meltwater some decades down the line suddenly without a water supply. If you think about a city like La Paz in the Andes, or Quito in Ecuador in the Andes, these are high-elevation cities that depend on glacial meltwater for their drinking water supplies. And they're beginning to realize that with the increased melting of these glaciers, which are really picking up speed, as I'm sure you've read about, a couple decades down the line, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, there'll be no water supply left for these high-elevation cities. Where do they get their supply? And third, warmer temperatures are going to significantly change the timing of river flows that are coming out of the world's mountainous regions, rivers that depend on mountain snowpacks for their flow. And think about which rivers we're talking about. We're talking about all the rivers that come out of the Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, the Cascades, the Sierra Nevadas. I'm probably forgetting some mountain regions, the Andes. The flow is going to dramatically change. Why? Because in the wintertime, you're going to get more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow. And the snow that does fall is going to melt sooner in the year rather than later. And so you're going to get more spring runoff and less flow in the summertime, in the drier months of the summer, when you need that water, especially much for irrigation, for maintaining flows for fish, and so on. So even if there's no change in precipitation overall in these regions, the shift in the timing, more flooding in the spring, lower flows in the summer, is going to make the management of that water and the meeting of needs for food production, for hydroelectricity generation, for urban water supply, all that much more difficult. So all of this has enormous implications for what we've been talking about: food security, human health, drinking water supplies, and managing this competition for water. So the question is where we go from here. My sense is, and I think you'd agree with me after listening to a fairly gloomy picture of where the world's water is now, is that if we're going to have any hope of meeting that challenge I laid out at the beginning of this talk, meeting the water needs of 8 billion people while we protect the aquatic ecosystems that support us, we're going to need a very fundamentally different way of managing, valuing, thinking about water. I've always loved Einstein's reminder to us that you can't solve a problem within the mindset that created it. And I think this is one of those problems, that we're going to need a new mindset if we're going to get out of this fix. And it seems to me that the mindset that we're going to need soon is one that fundamentally integrates ecological health and ecosystem services, the value of nature when it comes to water, into human use and allocation and management of water. And this is a dramatically different way of looking at things. Throughout human history, what have we done? As our demands for water have increased, we've gone out and looked for more supply. And as long as there was more supply out there to get, that worked pretty well. A lot of ecological degradation along the way, but we could get the water and we could meet our needs. That's not working anymore. We've got rivers running dry, groundwater falling, and all of these problems we've been talking about tonight. So it's going to take a fundamentally different approach. And I want to show you a simple diagram of what this might look like. Instead of a pie chart where you see the human use of water, the H, claiming more and more of the pie, which is the old way of thinking about things, what this little diagram, it's a very simple diagram, what it says, though, is that we want to, at some point, draw a boundary around how big the human piece of the pie is going to get. And that boundary needs to reflect the fact that the ecosystem is doing important work for us, and we don't want to lose that work. And this is something we haven't done yet, but it's something we need to do. And that sustainability boundary is what we call it. This is from my last book, Rivers for Life, with my co-author, Brian Richter. It says to us that beyond that point, we're actually losing more than we're gaining, because we're making too much of an inroad into those important ecological services that give us so much value in society. And so if we draw this boundary, what we get is more of a maximization of the total value of water, not just the value when we take it out of a river and use it to grow a crop or use it to make a computer or make clothes, but the value of that water in its natural environment and all the good work that it's doing. It increases public welfare, not only for our generation, but across generations, which is something we need to be thinking about. And very importantly, it unleashes the incredibly untapped potential of conservation and efficiency. And to me, this is the name of the game of 21st century water management. It's not a pie in which the human piece keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger so that there's nothing left for the ecosystem. The Errol C. image comes to mind. It's something that says water in its natural state has value, and we need to draw a boundary around, a limit around how much human use of water is going to modify that and take from that. And that's the way we're going to maximize total value. The million-dollar question, of course, is how we actually do this. How do we implement this? And I want to talk about just a few important things of translating this sort of conceptual view into reality. The first thing we need to do, I'll take the next slide. The first thing we need to do is do exactly this, allocate flows specifically for ecosystem health, which means providing freshwater ecosystems with the quantity, the quality, and the timing of flows that they need to sustain their health and ecosystem services. This may sound sort of pie in the sky, but there's a growing number of countries that are beginning to grapple with this. South Africa was one of the first. In 1994, when they had an opportunity to begin rewriting their constitution, rewriting all their laws with the new post-apartheid government in place, they began reworking all their water laws. And they passed a very progressive law in 1998 that said, we're going to establish a water reserve that does two things, meets the basic needs of people, but also meets the basic water needs of ecosystems, so that we not only have healthy people, we have healthy ecosystems too. And on the heels of that, a number of international conferences and a number of other countries have begun to look at this as an important feature of their water policy, to specifically allocate flows to the environment, not just to human uses directly. We're having a tougher time making headway on this in the United States, but if you look at this map of 1,900, next slide please, 1,932 federal dams in this country. These are publicly funded dams. These are dams managed by our federal agencies. And imagine if we asked that question of all these dams. Is there a way that we could reoperate these dams to take the health of the environment into account? Most of them were built for the traditional purposes of flood control, hydropower, irrigation, water supply. But imagine if we asked that question, river by river. Can we manage this dam in a way that not only meets those traditional needs for water, but begins to restore the aquatic environment upstream and downstream of these dams? And there are some indications from early work on this that we can make a lot of progress if we just ask this question systematically, river by river. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually has a partnership with the Nature Conservancy looking at about a dozen dams and asking this question. And there's been good results on the Green River in Kentucky. I was down in on the Savannah River about this time last year looking at an artificial flood release trying to help endangered fish get upstream to spawn with the spring flood. So I think a lot of progress can be made by asking this question about reoperating our dams with ecological health in mind. The next thing we need to do is to think about doubling, tripling, quadrupling water productivity in all the major sectors, in agriculture, in cities, and in industries. The beauty of that boundary, drawing that circle around human use, is that it drives up water productivity. And what I mean by water productivity is the benefit or value we're getting out of each gallon or liter of water we extract from the natural environment. And if we draw that boundary, it's going to drive this right up. And we're going to need at least a doubling, possibly much more over time, if we're going to have any hope of meeting that challenge I've set out. Next slide. It's particularly important that we do this in agriculture. 70% of all the water we extract from the natural environment goes to irrigated agriculture. So this is sort of the big chunk of water that we need to be thinking about. Growing food's very water intensive. It takes about 1,000 tons of water to grow a ton of grain. But a lot of the water that's being used can be used much, much more effectively. If you think about these are sort of the top 5, I think, ways in which we can improve agricultural water productivity. Raising irrigation efficiency. I'm sure most of you have heard about a technology called drip irrigation. That's just one way of increasing what we call crop per drop, increasing irrigation efficiency. But drip irrigation accounts for 1% of world irrigated area, so it can be used much, much more widely. We need to improve rain-fed farming. 60% of our food comes from agricultural land watered only by rainfall. And so to the extent we can improve the productivity of these rain-fed lands, particularly in parts of Asia and Africa where there's serious problems with this, we can make a lot of improvement. Shifting to more climate-appropriate cropping patterns, that speaks for itself. Should we be growing thirsty crops in very dry climates when water is getting short? Getting more nutritional value per drop. This is a deeper concept into water productivity. To the extent that we can move our diets down the food chain a bit, eating less meat, for example, which takes 5 to 8 times more water to generate a unit of protein than other protein sources do. We can lessen our water footprint, in a sense, in our diet. And fifth, and this is a little counterintuitive, but I think it will become increasingly important, the idea of expanded urban farming. Sometime next year, we're going to cross an important demographic threshold where half the people on the planet are living in cities. And so the idea of urban agriculture, of using our rooftops and our gardens and our empty lots to grow crops, is going to become increasingly important. City like in China, some cities in China, including Shanghai as a good example, are already getting a lot of their food from urban gardens. Shanghai is more or less self-sufficient in milk and eggs, a lot of its vegetables, and growing 2 million tons of grain in urban gardens within the limits of the city itself. So I think this will become an increasingly important way of bridging the water-food gap in the decades ahead. Our cities overall have enormous potential to improve water productivity as well. Even though they account for only about 10% of total demand for water worldwide, if you think about cities, 1, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million people, it's very concentrated demand, and so it puts a lot of pressure on the rivers and lakes and groundwater sources around those urban environments. But when you look around at the world's cities, both industrial countries like the United States as well as developing countries, what you find is that 20, 30, 40% of the urban water supply is leaking away, just is lost through leakage. And yet then you find these same cities going out to build another dam or think about building a desalination plant when a quarter or more of their supply is already leaking away. It makes no sense to do this. The last 20 years, one thing we've learned for sure in cities is that conservation is much more than a response to, an emergency response to drought. That it is a very cost-effective, environmentally sound way of meeting long-term water needs. In this country, we passed legislation, about 15 years ago now, that requires water-efficient fixtures in our homes. I'm sure you all experienced this. 1.6 gallon toilets, 2.5 gallon per minute faucets and shower heads, which is building conservation into our urban infrastructure. By 2025, that single act of Congress is going to be saving us the equivalent water of 5 New York cities, without really expecting too much behavior change in any way from us, just building it right in. The next slide shows an example in my backyard, which is that the greater Boston area now has a total water use at the same level as it was 50 years ago. It's dropped back to where it was 50 years ago from an aggressive conservation program launched in 1987, fixing leaks, raising water prices, auditing industries, encouraging homeowners to retrofit their homes and put in water-efficient fixtures. And this saved more than $500 million in 1986 dollars for the consumers in Boston, and it totally prevented the need for a new diversion of water from the Connecticut River, which would have affected the salmon restoration efforts that were underway and a whole host of other environmental implications. There's so much water in the Quabbin Reservoir now, which supplies Boston, that we're talking about how we can begin to do restoration work on the Swift River, which is the river that was dammed in order to create the supply for Boston. So conservation works as a long-term strategy if we look to it. Stop thinking supply side, going out and finding more supply, and think creatively about how we can begin to manage demand. And this is not the only example, it just happens to be one in my backyard. New York City has done a good job, Los Angeles has reduced its water use, Albuquerque to some extent, Austin, Seattle, a number of cities that are doing a good job within this country. The big new frontier, by the way, next slide, is this, in this country especially, is the green lawn. This picture could be taken in Florida or Phoenix, right? Two very different climates, but you could have exactly the same looking landscape, even though it makes no sense whatsoever to have the same landscape in two such different climates. Affecting water quality, affecting habitat, affecting the health of ecosystems. So beginning to tie our landscape use to this water conservation challenge is really key. About half the water that's used in many residences in the West and increasingly in the East is going to water outdoor lawns. So this is the new frontier, I think, in water management in the domestic sector. Very important, next slide please, is this, which is that we need to link water, poverty, and human health. I mentioned that more than 1 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water. And it's very important to say this, that we read in the media sometimes about water scarcity, and often the example of 1 billion people not having access to water is used as an illustration or an example or a sign of this water scarcity, when in fact it's not. The reason 1 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water is not that water is scarce per se. The water is there. We're talking about a very small amount of water. The reason is that they are too poor to have access to this water, and the access has not been provided. So the political will and the financial support to provide access to these 1 billion people who now lack safe drinking water has not been there. So it is a challenge that can be met. It's not really a water scarcity problem. It is an access problem that has to do with political will and financial resources. It's hard to imagine, actually, more bang for the buck than providing access to safe drinking water for everyone. Women no longer have to walk great distances to get water. You see women in Africa still walking 3, 4, 5 miles a day to collect enough water to bring home. Girls don't go to school because they're helping collect water. So all kinds of changes in society happen when you begin to provide safe drinking water, adequate sanitation for people. The UN Millennium Development Goal is to attempt to reduce by half the proportion of people without access to safe drinking water by 2015. This is an achievable goal, and in my mind, it's an absolutely critical milestone on the path toward universal access, making sure everyone has access to safe drinking water. We also need, next slide, to link water poverty and hunger. We have today 850 million people in the world who don't have access to enough food for their nourishment and for their health. 850 million people who are hungry or to some degree malnourished. And the main reason they are hungry is that they have neither the means to produce the food that they need, nor do they have the income to purchase the food that they need. And most of these people are living on $1 a day on farms in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Now, this happens to be a photo I took in Bangladesh some years ago, and it's of a technology called a treadle pump. And you can see that this gentleman is operating this pump kind of like we operate a Stairmaster exercise machine in the gym. Bamboo poles, and he's treadling up and down. This pole costs the treadle pump costs $35 and netted most of these Bangladeshi farmers $100 in the first season. So the families I talked to that were beginning to use this treadle pump were not only no longer hungry, but they were beginning to actually grow crops that they could take to market and begin to get enough income to get out of that poverty trap. 1.2 million of these technologies, these treadle pumps, have been sold in Bangladesh alone. And this is just one example of a very important thing, of affordable irrigation technologies for poor farmers, growing crops on 5 acres or less. The irrigation age largely bypassed them. The diesel pumps and those kinds of technologies are too expensive. So the idea of affordable technologies disseminated and spread through market mechanisms, through other ways, can have an enormous impact on hunger, on poverty, and on improving livelihoods. We also need to begin to value and pay for ecosystem services. Next slide, please. There's a lot of creativity going into this now. We could spend an entire night talking about this. But the basic idea is beginning to link up the providers of these ecological services, which are often landowners in watersheds, farmers, foresters, and so on, working in watersheds, with those who are benefiting from the ecological services coming out of those watersheds. These are just 3 examples among many that we could cite. Interesting example in Quito, where you have a water utility and a hydropower producer and a beer manufacturer contributing to a watershed trust fund because they rely on the quality and the quantity of water coming out of that watershed. So they want to pay to protect the services coming out of the watershed. New York City investing about $1.5 billion to avoid the need to build a $6 billion filtration plant for water quality purposes. So it's saving money, and it's also investing in improving the quality of life in the Catskills and Delaware watersheds, where its water comes from. And a third example in Costa Rica, where there's a national program to try to pay landowners in watersheds for forest protection, to protect the quality and the quantity of water coming out of those watersheds. Just 3 examples, and there are many more. But the idea of valuing those ecological services and compensating those who are being stewards of those services. And lastly, I think this is very important, that we begin to hold in ourselves a vision of a water-secure world, to believe that we can have a water-secure world, and to do our part to create it. There's a role in all of this for everyone as a citizen, for everyone as a professional. There's a role in helping create this water-secure world. And it seems to me the core ethical construct at work here is one that says that enough water should be provided for all living things before some get more than enough. And so an ethic of sharing, I think, underpins all of what we're talking about tonight, in providing enough water for all before some get more than enough. So I hope you'll join me in thinking about that vision and how we can become a part of it. I thank you again for celebrating World Water Day, and I'm looking forward to our respondents and to some questions as the evening goes on. Thank you so much for your attention.
If there was a message for World Water Day 2007, to me it would be a new vision of a water-secure world. And if we took anything away tonight, I think this would be the one thing that I think you have left with us that we appreciate very much. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Noel Brown, and I'm asked to be the moderator of our conversation this evening. And as you'll soon discover, the moderator's lot is not a happy one. It is my task this evening to keep the conversation going, to limit the time of the speakers and panelists, and to ensure that you, the audience, have an opportunity to exchange views and perhaps put challenges to us, fill gaps in the conversation that we started. But also, I believe I will confront my limits, my technical limits this evening, because I understand this will be an internet broadcast, and it requires a sensitivity in terms of timing, and as a result of that, one has to be very careful and very measured in the way we present the remarks this evening. But what I'd certainly like to do at the outset is to introduce not only the program, but my co-panelists this evening. The first is Dr. Ken Strzepek, who is Professor of Civil, Environmental and Architectural Engineering at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Then there is Dr. Brent Blackwelder, President of the Friends of the Earth and the most senior environmental lobbyist in Washington, D.C., having testified before Congress over 100 times. These people will be joining the conversation via the internet, and I hope we get it right so that we will be able to give them enough time to make comments and enlarge the conversation. But if I may, I would like to say again, Sandra, your presentation was so rich and so thoughtful that it would be very presumptuous of me to try to offer anything by way of meaningful comments. I would, however, like to say thank you, and particularly for giving the right emphases to the right issues. I think you're quite right at the outset when you say that water is a unique resource. It has no peers, and to a very large extent, there is no science on earth that can create an additional drop of water. All the water that we have on the planet today is all the water we will ever have. And so consequently, it's an extremely precious resource, but we do not seem to be valuing it that way. Secondly, there's the equity problem. Water is seldom in the right place at the right time, in the right quantity and the right quality. Some countries are extremely water rich, like the United States and Canada. I understand, for example, that the Great Lakes and Lake Baikal contains about 2/5 of the world's standing fresh water. And some countries, as you so graphically demonstrated this evening, are water poor. And that is why we need to rethink how we deal with the water problem. You mentioned the way we have dammed the world and to an extent changed the salinity balance. I'm not sure we fully appreciate what this means in terms of tampering with vital ecosystems. I know, for example, that some places in the Mediterranean are literally biological deserts because we have changed the salinity balance and the area becomes much too salty and is not able to sustain life there. And we'll have to pay the consequence of that. But I think one of the major emphases that I'd like to underscore is the kind of values that we place on our water stocks. You mentioned the ecosystem services that are being provided, and some of them never cost them out. I think once we start putting monetary values on these, I think we'll get a much better measure. At this stage, I do not think we have done a good job in trying to provide the right and proper values. And so I wonder whether this may not be the time and the place where we give kids a better appreciation of water. I know, for example, in Australia, there's a program called the Kids Water Watch, where certain schools are outfitting young people with testing kits and turning them loose in the community. And they are relentless investigators. But what happens in the process is not simply the reports that they provide, but the values that they begin to appreciate in terms of what water does. And I think perhaps we should start looking at new water curricula and with the ways in which we might engage young people actively in appreciating the water. In your challenges, you mentioned the question of rain-fed agriculture, and you gave us some rather interesting ways in which you might want to look at this. I wonder whether you would also include here rainwater and stormwater harvesting, in the extent to which drinking water supplies are quite often intermittent and that we cannot entirely rely on them. In some countries, for example, like Bermuda, the roof lines are so configured as to become water catchment systems, and they are now fed into underground tanks so that local homeowners will be able to have a reliable supply of water. I was in Bermuda some weeks ago, and it was raining, and one of my colleagues said to me, well, I'm so glad it's raining because only 90 gallons in my tank. Suddenly, she discovered what she had left and how she must conserve it. Now, I don't know how many gallons I have in my tank, but I know I have adequate water supply. So I wonder whether we should not be doing more to encourage the better value, better evaluation, and better appreciation of water. I think you've introduced to us some rather interesting concepts this evening, and I hope we can follow through on them. And finally, you mentioned the way the world community is responding to this. The Millennium Development Goals, for example, has now placed water and sanitation as a major priority. And we're now talking about how to halve the question of poverty and make available drinking water for half the world's poor by the year 2015. And I think this is a good idea, that if we can halve global poverty, make more water available to the world's poor, it's a good thing. But what about the other half? I think there needs to be a better ethics in the way we distribute water. And I'd like to put a challenge to you, Sandra. Have we reached the point where we might be able to develop a global water master plan? We know the behavior of the hydrological cycle, and we have some rough calculations of what is where. Is it possible for the world not only to allocate new river development systems and replenish these stocks, but to take a new look at the world water picture and see how far we might be able to ensure that not only the 50% who lack safe drinking water, but the entire world community may have better access. Because you have given us the consequences in terms of water and health, water and productivity, water and life, and the fact that waterborne disease kills a large number of children in a way that is a bit of a shame for the world community. Is it possible for us to therefore rethink this, and is the world ready for a world water master plan? If you can rethink the dams, if you can rethink replenishing, if you can rethink banking groundwater, rebanking it, is it possible we can go that route? I simply throw this out because I'd like to see whether or not we can encourage some discussion on the way we manage water. It's not enough to lament the dangers and to cite the fact that the world is heading for a water crisis. And we can show the tension spots. Rivers like the Nile, which is shared by 10 states, does hold some very serious potential for conflict. Because as states draw on more and more water from the Nile, those at the end of the pipe may be left in a water deficit state. And this could create very, very serious problems for that body of water. So consequently, I think we need to take a very hard look as to whether the world is ready, whether the mechanisms are in place, and whether we have the vision of a more water-secure world. And if that is the case, then how do we get there from here? And maybe in the conversation, we might be able to get some thoughts on that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to now call on my co-panelists, Dr. Brent Blackwelder, President of the Friends of the Earth, if he might want to join the conversation, and then following him will be Dr. Ken Strzepek. Are we online?
It's Brent Blackwelder here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Doctor, we can hear you very well. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on World Water Day 2007.
From the Friends of the Earth standpoint, we need to eliminate the real waste and the over-engineering of river systems. What we are doing in the United States now is to remove dams. We have removed over 500 dams in the last 35 years begin the natural rehabilitation and restoration of rivers. Use the engineering to fix all the awful leaks, the inefficient pumps and so forth, but stop rearranging the world's rivers where we're putting gigantic doses of cholesterol into the veins and arteries, the lifeblood of the earth. And as a result, we get all of those disasters that Sandra Postel eloquently described. We're destroying the wonderful ecosystem services that the great rivers of the world once supplied to us. We need to bring back and restore that productivity in living in harmony with nature.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll hear now from Dr. Ken Strzepek. Your reaction, please.
Excellent talk addressing many of the issues that are key to global water issues. In Sandra's solutions, all I want to do to add today is to caution that we do not run to the extreme with all of the solutions, that we keep a balance. And while I agree with Brent that there are probably too many dams, to represent those who have built some of those dams, one of the key problems in the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is the great variability of the climate. We are faced by droughts, and then we are faced by floods. And floods are incredibly damaging, both in terms of human life and loss of capital. But what this great variability does is does not allow for the subsistence farmers and the poor, in many cases, to be able to plan for investments of resources that would allow development. So dams have come along so that we can store water from rainy season to dry or from year to year. And in the past, we have implemented this very good aspect of storage of water from season to season, but we have done it blindly and not taking into account many of the other uses of water and nature's first call to the water. So my addition or appendage to the talk is, as we look at that, we need to look at how we balance the need, particularly of the poor, in trying to provide a more stable environment for which they can develop and they can rely on water. And as we look, it's just not humans that build dams, but we have the beaver, and for their particular need, they developed their own dam building activities. And the last thing that happens out in the West, which is an issue that does not negate anything Sandra suggested, but things we just have to take into account. Over the last 100 years in the Great Plains in Colorado and Nebraska, we have built dams to store water for irrigation. And what has happened is we've developed a new ecosystem. And in studies to improve irrigation efficiency, what it will mean is, and if we reduce the dams, that there will be no water in the streams in September and October. And so we have a great debate, and there's not a clear answer, as to do we return to the natural system of the early 1800s, where we had a very strong peak spring runoff, and then dry fall, or do we have the case where the soil moisture from over-irrigation acts as a dam and releases the water later, and we have developed a new ecosystem. And if we were to revert, we would be changing our ecosystem. So I applaud all of the issues and the efforts also of Friends for the Earth and the other areas of removing unnecessary dams and working on remanagement of those dams for human and ecosystem purposes. But we have to be careful that we do it in a way that understands some of the other consequences, particularly to the poor and to the current ecosystems.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased that you're introducing the precautionary principles as we approach or we search for solutions. I also fully agree with you that given the climate variability and the lack of predictability, the question of planning for secure water systems is a very complicated and very challenging one. But I hope that at this point we might be able to get some reactions and comments from the floor, because I'd like to make this a conversation since we are all stakeholders in this subject. The floor is open for reactions to the presentation as well as to that of Dr. Strzepek and Blackwelder. Comments, reactions, and observations, please.
Just a quick question. Could you discuss commercialization of fresh water?
The question is commercialization of fresh water. I might just try to make a stab at one and ask my colleagues. I was intrigued this morning in the New York Times with a full-page ad by Starbucks urging the world to observe Water Day and to become more engaged in a water plan they have to bring water to the poor. Last week at the United Nations, Nestle outlined its own water plan for the 21st century. It was rather interesting that these two major beverage producers that require reliable and predictable supply of clean water seem to be taking on the water challenge. What does this mean? When you combine that with the privatization of this very scarce and valuable resource, does this complicate the water picture, or does it make it more promising for the people who are water short? So I'd like to add to your concern and perhaps open and get reactions from both other members of the panel and the floor.
I would have to say from my experience from looking at a recent report of the United States and seeing around the globe that one of the problems is the commercialization of water has been mostly a mechanism for helping to raise revenues, because in many cases what has been commercialized is the distribution of the water and not the total management of the watershed. And in a number of situations, the watershed was left to be managed by the municipality, and the distribution was commercialized, and then therefore the revenues that normally came from the water distribution, which the commercial entities are now gathering, or we call that in economics the rent, were no longer available for managing the watershed as a public good. So I have to exactly agree with Brent. However, we have to be careful to not confuse the commercialization with the pricing of water, and to approach water management from an economic point of view, and that we, with the poor protected, like in South Africa with their 6,000 liters per year free and then the others paying. But we have to manage our resource in a way to value it from an economic point of view. But the privatization or commercialization of parts of the water system many times leave the source supply and some of the other areas not protected. And I think it should be done with great caution.
My concern is whether, when we talk commercialization, we're not talking about commodification of a public good, and whether water itself can be commodified as so many other resources. I think you're also quite right in that we should make a distinction between the product and the process. And in the commercial field, we look at the resource, or water as such, and not the watersheds. And consequently, we're leaving a large piece of the puzzle untended. And that is a very real and urgent question that also needs to be addressed. Sandra, I'd like you to comment on these things, but I'm waiting to get a couple more questions, then we'll ask you to do the wrap-up for us. Reactions and comments, please.
Most of us may realize between here and Georgia we have some of the finest water in the world, some of the best sources for springs anywhere. And as an avid spring goer, I've seen substantial decay in the quality of some of these springs in the last 2 years. And in spite of there being literally billions of water, billions of gallons per day coming dumped out into the Gulf, we've created 2 desalination plants here locally, which produce 25 million each at maximum efficiency. The point is, it seems to me the cult of greed, nationally and internationally, has committed 2 grievous errors. One is to allow the degradation of the water supply simultaneously for commercial reasons to create desalination plants when the need really isn't there if we just rechanneled what we have. We have a house that's 80 years old. It originally was built to capture the water as they do in Bermuda, and I don't think anywhere in St. Pete they're doing that now. So I guess my question is for Sandra and the other panelists, if there are any advice or activities that we could be engaged in locally or internationally to perhaps counter some of these trends. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
On the privatization issue, I think part of the reason there was an interest in privatizing and commercializing, to some extent, water sources was the feeling that governments weren't doing a good enough job. We had 1 billion people lacking access, and in many cases, there was sort of poor governance of these systems, corruption in some cases, and so the thought was to bring in private sector interest to try to help move this process along. I think it's been a very mixed bag, and I basically agree with Brent that because of the importance of the public interest values in water, I think it's better to keep the ownership and largely the management of water in the public sector so that the broad spectrum of public values is taken into account. Corporations, by law, have to have their shareholders' interests at stake first and foremost, whereas when I turn on my tap, I want to make sure that whoever's providing me my water has my interests at stake first and foremost. I think the accountability issue is really key. And where you're lacking good governance, you're also often lacking the regulations that oversee private sector involvement in water sources. So by and large, I think it's better if we work on having good governance in water in our public water systems and not turning those tasks over to the private sector per se. Having said that, the involvement of the private sector is critical in fixing leaks, in distributing drip irrigation, in all these kinds of ways of improving water productivity. So doing that is very important. The question from the gentleman just preceding me, I think is extremely important. One of the issues Florida's facing is that you're downstream from Georgia and Alabama on a couple major river systems that come into your state. The incredibly wonderful oyster fishery in Apalachicola Bay is going to be at stake and very much to some degree a consequence of what happens to water use in Atlanta, over which you have no control. And so coming to some agreement in the Apalachicola river system with Alabama and with Georgia is going to be critical to protecting your downstream fisheries within Apalachicola Bay, including the oyster fishery there. And so that's a very, very good example of the need for cooperation, one state to another in a shared river system. And it's the same sort of problem we're facing in river systems among countries around the world. So I think that kind of cooperation is absolutely critical.
I understand that we have run out of time, and as I said earlier, you'll see why the moderator's lot is not a happy one. I feel we have shortchanged you because this is such a rich subject. We had so much in Sandra's remarks. Our two co-panelists were standing by, and yet we have to cut it at this time. But what I'd like to do as we conclude this evening is to really salute the city and the sponsors for supporting this initiative of the United Nations International Days, and Water Day being the first one. I think this provides an opportunity for local communities to be engaged in the global arguments. And I would hope that this, as the beginning of the series, will encourage you to continue participating, and I'm sure you'll find this to be a very rich and enriching experience. With that being said, Sandra, I'd like to thank you very much for opening the subject for us. It was an extraordinary presentation. Ken and Brent, thank you for participating virtually, at the same time giving us the benefits of your thought, experience, and wisdom. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.